The story of 1836 Virginia begins in the quiet countryside, where grief and faith intertwined in the life of Eleanor Whitmore. Her husband, Nathaniel, was a modest tobacco farmer who met a sudden, brutal end when a dispute with neighboring landowners turned violent. They found his body near the riverbank, his head crushed by a blow from an iron tool. The townsfolk pitied Eleanor, for she was known as a gentle, devout woman who spent her days in church and her nights tending the poor. But when Nathaniel was buried, something inside her shifted. In the weeks following the funeral, she refused visitors. Neighbors heard her weeping long into the night, and the pastor who came to console her left the house pale and trembling, muttering that grief had twisted her mind. Months later, the truth began to creep through the whispers. Eleanor had taken her husband's skull from the grave. They said she kept it on a table beside her bed, wrapped in a white cloth, and that every morning and night, before she knelt to pray, she would unwrap it gently, press her lips to its crown, and whisper her devotions. The act, she claimed, was not madness but faith, her way of keeping Nathaniel close until God called her to join him. When asked by the Reverend if she understood the sin in her behavior, she replied softly, "How can love be sin if the Lord himself raised the dead?" Over time, strange things began to happen in the Whitmore home. Visitors swore they heard two voices praying in unison, though Eleanor lived alone. Lamps flickered when no wind blew, and doors creaked open by themselves. One night, a stable boy passing by saw her standing in the garden, speaking to someone unseen, her hands cupped as though cradling something fragile. By spring of 1837, Eleanor had wasted away to a shadow. She was found one Sunday morning in her pew, motionless, her lips pressed against the skull she had carried there in her basket. Witnesses said she looked peaceful, even radiant, as if finally reunited. The pastor ordered that she be buried beside her husband, but when they opened his grave, they found the coffin empty, save for the white cloth that once wrapped the skull. To this day, the old church in Cumberland County stands, its bell rusted and its pews empty. Local legend claims that on certain nights, when the moonlight spills through the broken windows, one can see a pale figure kneeling near the altar, whispering prayers to a shape resting in her hands. The air hums faintly with two voices, rising and falling together, a wife and her beloved, bound by devotion that neither time nor death could unmake. The second chapter of Eleanor Whitmore's strange and sorrowful tale begins in the cold months that followed her husband's burial. The air in Cumberland carried the weight of frost and rumor, and though the townsfolk pitied her at first, pity quickly gave way to fear. By December of 1836, no one dared approach the Whitmore house after sundown. The curtains were always drawn tight, yet faint light flickered within, as though someone walked room to room holding a candle and whispering prayers to the dead. Those who lived nearest claimed that, on certain nights, the smell of damp earth drifted from her open window. Eleanor herself seldom left the house. When she did, it was always after dark, her black veil drawn low over her face. She carried a small bundle wrapped in linen, clutching it close to her chest as she walked to the churchyard. The caretaker once followed her and saw her kneel by her husband's grave, though what she placed upon the soil he could not tell. When he asked her later if she needed help, she smiled faintly and said, "He listens better now." Inside her home, the transformation deepened. The parlor, once filled with sunlight and flowers, had become a chamber of relics. The portraits of saints were draped with mourning cloth, the mirrors covered so that no reflection might betray what lingered behind her. In the center of the table, beneath the soft glow of a single candle, rested the skull of Nathaniel Whitmore. She had polished it until it gleamed like ivory. Around its base lay a rosary, and each bead bore a faint stain of her blood from the nightly prayers she whispered with trembling hands. By January, the Reverend Samuel Greaves decided to intervene. He came at noon, when the light was strongest, and found Eleanor seated in silence, her fingers tracing the grooves of the skull. When he spoke her name, she turned to him slowly, her eyes distant, her voice thin as winter wind. "You speak as though he were gone," she said, "but can you not feel him still? He sits with me when I pray. He answers in the silence." The Reverend tried to reason with her, to remind her that the Lord forbade communion with the dead. But Eleanor only smiled and asked, "Did not Lazarus return when called?" The Reverend left shaken, muttering that he would send her kin to take her away. Days passed, and a strange energy began to stir in the house. Lamps that burned low would flare without warning. Books fell from shelves, though no breeze stirred the air. Once, Eleanor awoke to find muddy footprints across her floor, bare, wide, and unmistakably male. She followed them to the table where the skull rested, and though her heart pounded with terror, she felt a deep, radiant joy bloom within her. "You came back to me," she whispered, pressing her lips to the cold bone. From that night forward, she no longer wept. In February, a young servant girl named Clara was sent by the Reverend's wife to deliver bread. She knocked and heard faint movement inside, but when the door opened, Eleanor's face was pale as wax, her eyes sunken yet strangely luminous. She invited Clara in with a soft, polite tone, though her smile did not reach her eyes. The girl later swore that as she entered, she heard a low humming from the parlor, two voices entwined, one human and one deeper, vibrating like wind through hollow wood. Clara saw the skull resting on the table and screamed. Eleanor placed a finger to her lips and said, "Hush, child, you'll wake him." By March, the town had turned against her. Parents forbade their children from passing the Whitmore gate. The Reverend spoke of temptation and possession from the pulpit, though he refused to name her directly. Yet even he could not deny what others whispered, that late at night they saw a man's silhouette in her window. It stood beside her as she prayed, its head bowed, its shoulders broad, the outline unmistakably that of Nathaniel Whitmore. The fear reached its breaking point on the night of April 3rd. A storm swept through Cumberland, tearing branches from the oaks and setting the church bell swinging without a hand to pull it. Lightning flashed across the valley, illuminating the Whitmore house in bursts of silver light. Neighbors later claimed they saw two figures standing in the yard, one holding a lantern, the other leaning close, as if whispering secrets into the other's ear. At midnight, the house went dark. When morning came, the Reverend and two men from the parish went to check on her. The door was unlocked, swinging gently in the wind. Inside, every candle had burned down to wax puddles. The skull on the table was gone. In its place sat a freshly dug mound of dirt, damp and smelling of the grave. Eleanor herself was nowhere to be found. They searched the grounds until dusk and finally discovered her in the churchyard. She was kneeling by her husband's grave, her dress soaked and her hands caked with mud. When they tried to move her, she screamed, not in fear but in fury. "You'll tear us apart," she cried, her voice echoing through the trees. It took 3 men to drag her away. The Reverend ordered that she be kept under watch at the rectory until she recovered, but that night she escaped. Only her prayer shawl was found, draped across the altar. Weeks turned into months. The Whitmore house fell into decay, and vines crept up its walls. Travelers spoke of strange lights flickering inside, and the sound of 2 voices whispering prayers. The Reverend himself grew ill, and would not speak of what he saw the night before his death, save for one haunting phrase he uttered to his assistant: "They pray as one now." In the summer of 1837, children playing near the churchyard discovered something glinting in the soil. A rosary, its beads cracked and brown with age. When the pastor's son lifted it, the earth beneath began to crumble, revealing a hollow space beneath the grave. Inside lay 2 skeletons, their hands entwined, their skulls facing one another. The smaller bones of a bird were scattered at their feet, as if something small and loyal had died there with them. The townspeople reburied the remains under a single stone, marked only with a cross. But at night, when the wind swept through the valley, the bell above the church rang faintly, though no hand touched its rope. And in the stillness that followed, some swore they heard a soft kiss pressed to bone, and a woman's voice whispering through the dark, "Amen." By the winter of 1838, the Whitmore house had become part of Virginia folklore. Children dared each other to step through its gate and run to the front door before sunset. Few made it more than halfway. The windows, once clear, were now black with soot. The air around the property held a strange heaviness, as though the soil itself remembered too much. When the wind rose, it carried whispers that sounded like prayers or sobs. The story of Eleanor's disappearance should have ended with the discovery of the entwined skeletons, yet the people of Cumberland knew otherwise. It began again with the arrival of a stranger, a man calling himself Dr. Ambrose Keene, who claimed to be researching cases of religious mania. He was tall, gaunt, with a voice that trembled like a whisper in a church. He rented a room at the inn and spent his days asking questions no one wished to answer. His nights, they said, were spent walking the churchyard, lantern in hand. The townsfolk avoided him, but curiosity grew when he began purchasing medical supplies from the apothecary: carbolic acid, scalpels, and linen bandages. Some said they saw him carting these supplies toward the old Whitmore house, though no one dared follow. Within weeks, strange lights returned to the windows. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed through the valley, striking bone. One night, a farmer claimed to have seen the silhouette of a woman standing beside him in the candlelight. Inside the house, Dr. Keene kept meticulous notes. He wrote of hearing whispers, of seeing shadows move in the corners of his vision. In his letters to a colleague in Richmond, he described an overwhelming presence, something neither spirit nor hallucination. "She lingers," he wrote, "not as ghost but as faith incarnate, bound by the flesh she refuses to relinquish." He believed Eleanor's devotion had created a bridge between the living and the dead, and he sought to prove it through science. One night in February, the townsfolk heard the church bell tolling without wind. It continued until dawn. When morning came, the bell was cracked clean through. The Reverend's son went to the Whitmore property to investigate, but when he returned, he was pale and trembling, unable to speak for days. When he finally recovered, he told the sheriff that he had seen a light glowing beneath the house, like a lantern deep underground, and heard voices murmuring the Lord's Prayer in 2 tones, one soft and human, the other deep and hollow. Dr. Keene's journal, later found among the ruins, told the rest. He claimed to have exhumed the Whitmore grave, and what he found there was impossible. The 2 skeletons had changed. The bones were fused together at the wrists and ribs, as though the bodies had begun to merge. The skulls were aligned mouth to mouth. "The flesh remembers," he wrote. "The soul is only its echo." His final entry was dated February 23rd. She has asked me to finish what began in faith. I hear them both now, and I understand. He was never seen again. In the spring thaw, a hunter passing through the valley found the door to the Whitmore house open. Inside, the furniture had rotted to dust, but the floorboards were stained with dark streaks. The air smelled faintly of earth and myrrh. In the parlor, where once the skull had sat, lay two sets of footprints, one small, one large, pressed deep into the floor as though burned there. Between them, on the table, rested a single white lily. Its petals had not wilted, though no one had stepped inside for months. The town sealed the house that year, nailing its doors shut, but it never stayed sealed. Each time they boarded it up, the nails would be found loosened by morning. By 1842, the structure collapsed entirely, leaving only the stone foundation and the well behind it. The well was deep, too deep for the tools they had, and the water inside shimmered faintly even on moonless nights. Years passed, the valley changed hands, the church fell into ruin, but the legend persisted. Travelers claimed that when the mist rolled through Cumberland, one could see a woman in black kneeling beside a figure that looked almost human, both bent over something unseen. Others spoke of hearing a kiss carried on the wind, followed by a whisper. He listens better now. In 1881, a team of surveyors rebuilding the road uncovered what they thought was an old root cellar near the site of the Whitmore home. Inside they found a stone altar carved with the Latin words Memoria Eterna, eternal memory. Upon it lay two skulls, perfectly preserved, fused together at the crown. A rosary was wrapped around them, its beads unbroken, though centuries of decay should have turned it to dust. The skulls were taken to Richmond for study but vanished before they could be examined. The records end there. What remained, however, was the legend, the story of the woman who would not let death silence her love. To this day, the ruins of the Whitmore house are avoided. Locals say that on cold nights, when the mist curls low and the bell of the ruined church rings without wind, a figure can be seen kneeling in the dark, pressing her lips to something pale and gleaming in her hands. And if you listen long enough, you can hear a second voice, deep, soft, answering her prayer with the same eternal devotion. The valley keeps their secret well, but sometimes when a traveler wanders too close, they return with the same hollow look in their eyes, as though something followed them home. They speak of a feeling like being watched, of whispers in the walls. And when asked what they heard, they always repeat the same final words Elinor was said to have spoken before she vanished. We are one in him, and he is one in us.